Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome back to Liberty with Love with Robin Koerner. It is good to be back at the microphone. It is good to have you with me. And what interesting times we live in. It's, this living in Donald Trump's reality show, it's kind of like being a kid at Advent, I think. You know those Advent calendars, and each day you wake up and you open one of the doors and you see if you get a candy you like or a candy you don't like. So you either smile or you wince. Every time I wake up now, I check the Drudge Report or whatever it is to see if the latest executive order is awesome or terrifying. And today, actually, it was awesome because this is being recorded on a day when Donald Trump issued an executive order and this is, I believe, an entirely appropriate and proper use of the executive order to require that should any federal agencies wish to institute a new regulation, they must delete two. So for a new one, if you want one so bad, you got to institute a new one. You got to find two that you got to get rid of so that you can have it. What a great policy, because it is, I know this is kind of an issue that's been turned into an issue of ideology, but it is clearly true that we have more regulations than we know what to do with. They are suffocating businesses, and that means they hurt people. And as I am very fond of saying on this show, the only legitimate ends of politics are people. But, you know, even as a kind of one-man band, little S corporation, which is how I do all of my stuff, I know that to be true. And so I was kind of delighted by almost like it was almost like a meta regulation, you know, a meta regulation to delete two for every new one that Trump signed today. And I say it's a proper use of an executive order because, of course, all government agencies operate under the executive, which is a huge fundamental problem in and of itself. And to make sense of this, you need to know that these government agencies get to write regulation with the force of law, which never get voted on by our representatives. So there's something inherently non-democratic about that, anti-constitutional about that, but that is the world we live in. And maybe Trump's executive order today might do something small to turn the tide, but we shall see. The reason I mention that is because we are going to be talking about regulations today in a somewhat different context with a very good friend of mine whom regular listeners to this show may remember. Glenn Morgan, welcome back to the show.
Robin, thank you so much. It's always great to be on Liberty with Love. And, of course, we do everything in the political process with love for our fellow man. At least that's activists like myself and like you. That's what we're always trying to do. And I love the example that you use of trying to control some of this administrative law that, amazingly enough, it's Donald Trump actually writing something like that right now.
Yeah, I know. You know, sometimes this authoritarian by instinct president of ours does something really authoritarian. So it seems. And then the next day he does something that's kind of more libertarian than any libertarian-leaning guy I know has managed to pass in ages. So the whole thing is, it is a roller coaster. It's, it's Donald Trump's reality show and we just live in it. But it's so much more entertaining, isn't it, than if the other one had won.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it certainly adds a level of unpredictability to what you're going to read as a headline the next day. So that's exactly. At least it makes it a little bit more interesting. But and I'm glad you mentioned that because this, people a lot of times don't realize this administrative law, which is really what he's referring to here. scholars have talked about that, this buildup of the administrative state, the bureaucracy that many of us like to complain about. It entirely exists with this rulemaking process that not a single legislator at the state level or a congressman at the federal level has ever voted on. These are thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of pages of rules that you can go to prison for, or get put in jail, or be fined for, that not a single elected representative ever approved of. They just passed an overall umbrella law, and then they said, in effect, told the bureaucracy, interpret this how you'd like and abuse people how you'd like with the overall umbrella that we gave you to abuse them with. And it's amazing.
It is amazing. And actually, Glenn, since we've started here, this isn't the main thing I wanted to talk to you about, but I am reminded of a piece of legislation that you're trying to move in the House of our home state of Washington, right, to actually defeat this problem in our state of Washington.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a bill that we proposed. It's of course, we didn't really mention this time, but I'm the executive director for the Citizens Alliance for Property Rights, and property rights is a fundamental human right that we're oftentimes constitutional right that we're out there trying to defend, that has been constantly eroded for a long time in this country. And we've approached it with some types of legislation that we've had friendly legislators draft and propose, and it creates such amazing concepts like one of them is that every one of these rules that is written by an agency needs to go back to the legislature to either be approved or denied. And to the average citizen, that sounds like a very commonsensical approach to resolving this problem. But by God, when you propose this, the bureaucracy explodes like you have just done some incredible evil thing to even come up with that idea.
I'm interested, Glenn. What's the nature of the negative reactions you get to that? Because that is across the board. I don't care if you're liberal, you're conservative, whatever. That is an appealing, democratic, protection, right? That most folks would want. So, what is the nature of the opposition that you get to that? From the political establishment.
Well, and the thing to remember about this is that although we oftentimes try to divide ourselves along this I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative sort of viewpoint, the biggest political power in the country isn't either one of those parties or parties that might try to affiliate themselves that way. It's actually the bureaucracy, the party of bureaucracy, which, is instead of a D or an R, it's a big B for bloated. And that they have all the power. And so their concern, of course, is that something like that would cause them to lose the power, and they can't admit that. So what they usually do to testify against it is they say, oh, it's so unworkable. We're always having to pass these rules, and they're usually so technical. We don't want to bother our elected officials with such trivia and little detail, and they'll come up with some minor example. They'll ignore the other 1,000 laws that they've rules, I should say, that they've passed. They'll come up with some minor one, and they'll say, see, you legislators, you guys are so important. You really wouldn't want to have to spend your time dealing with this, because otherwise that's all you'd be spending your time with. Of course, when they testify that way, it makes our case in many ways, but they are an incredible special interest, and they have a lot of power and pull with certainly with Democrats, probably a little bit less so with Republicans, but even some Republicans tend to be persuaded by that.
The bureaucracy of government as the special interest, the biggest main special interest. There's kind of a self-referential irony in there somewhere, isn't there? It's bizarre.
Oh, it is, yeah. It exists primarily to perpetuate itself.
Yeah.
And a rule like that, a law like that we would propose is a great threat to the power of bureaucracy. And but we will not stop pushing for that, because we recognize that a lot of our freedoms, not just property rights that we focus on, but a lot of our freedoms hinge on restraining the state and the rulemaking process that the bureaucracy has.
And that kind of fake flattery that the bureaucrats give to the representatives, is that working pretty well? I mean, does your legislation have any chance?
It's we proposed it for the first time last year, and it didn't get anywhere. I don't even believe that we got much of a hearing on it. This year I expect to have a hearing. And the way it kind of works is that you can't just give up if you don't win the first time. You have to keep pushing it until you can get further along in the legislative process. And I've done this with a few other bills over the years. And what happens is eventually you build up more support for it. Sometimes there's ways of writing it a little differently that are acceptable to more groups of people. And eventually you get to the point where you can maybe bring it to the floor for a full vote. And I don't know that we can get there this year, but we will keep pushing it until we can.
And if there is anybody I know that is good at keeping pushing, it is you, Glenn. And as we come to the end of this first segment, I just want to say to the listeners out there who may not know you or, heard one of our earlier shows together, because I've interviewed you a couple of times now, that you, Glenn, are you're like maybe my favorite activist. If I'm the velvet glove kind of activist, you are the iron fist. And we need both, right? But you have a special skill, and not just a special skill, I would say a very special kind of personality that enables you to take on what for most people would be the nightmares of bureaucracy and government and relish them and revel in them. And as we go into the break, I want to say a big thank you to you for that, because you're doing great work up here in Washington State. And we will come back in just a couple of minutes.
All right.
This is Liberty with Love. This is Robin Koerner, and I am speaking to my friend Glenn Morgan, who lives with me up here in the beautiful state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest. And so, Glenn, you know why I wanted to bring you on the show today.
Sure.
There are particular shenanigans. You're always involved in some kind of political shenanigans, but I particularly like the shenanigans that you're dealing, I was going to say dealing with, but actually you're dealing out right now. So I would like you to tell this story. Let's start with the backstory. What happened that caused you to get your feet wet in a whole new area of regulation and activism? How did it start?
Well, and actually the last segment is pretty good lead up to this, because we were talking about administrative law in the last segment. There's a whole other body of administrative law. There's a little pockets of these administrative law issues that go on out there. And the one that we're going to talk about now is really dealing with campaign finance. So campaign finance rules, all the rules that you have to follow if you're going to be involved in running for office or be involved in anything related to elections in our state. Every state has them, and they vary state to state. Washington State has some fairly aggressive campaign finance law on restrictions and transparency and reporting, all these different rulemaking processes. And I'd
just like to say, if I may interrupt for a second, the reason these warrant special attention is that these are rules that politicians make, kind of for politicians. Right? So as an activist, they present a set of opportunities that maybe many other regulations don't quite present. And I think the story you're about to tell is going to prove that.
I think, I would agree with you. And the one thing to remember about campaign finance laws in general is that absolutely they are written by politicians, but mostly they're written by incumbent politicians to restrain and constrain those who might dare to run against them. And this doesn't matter what party the politician's in. The incumbents tend to support the campaign laws that exist because it makes it harder for challengers or new people to the political process to navigate through the Byzantine world of campaign finance law and run a campaign without violating some elements of it.
And to that point, Glenn, just to frame that, it's worth noting that of the order of 95% of state and federal elections do not result in a change of representative.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So that gives weight to what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one more barrier for challengers in the political process, and especially new people who haven't been to the process before. Historically, it's in our state, Washington State, these rules, they pass a law that says they want transparency, and then the bureaucracy creates tons of these rules. And of course, the rules always require you to fill out paperwork and reporting and forms and times, all kinds of stuff like that. So two things happened that got me substantially involved in it this cycle. In order to do a little political action committee, which is you get some of your friends to throw some money together and you want to support or oppose a local election, then you have to file a lot of forms and set this up. And I had set up a little political action committee. I raised about $3,000 among my friends. It's not exactly a super PAC, And we did some robocalls in Thurston County, which is where I live, dealing with some county commissioner races. At the same time, I had noticed that the Secretary of State in Washington, whose name is Kim Wyman, had some campaign finance complaints filed against her, and the Attorney General of Washington State had found her guilty of these violations. And these violations were ridiculous because basically what she had done is she had found out that her campaign treasurer, who had been sick or gone for a little while, had failed to report some information on time, on a timely manner. So they'd reported it, but they were a couple weeks late. And so she went back and they made sure they reported everything and self-reported some of the information on some expenditures that they had made a little bit later.
So just to be clear here, she was clearly doing the right thing, and that motivated her action. And but there is something special about Kim Wyman politically, right, in the context of Washington politics, which is critical to the story. So what is that?
Yep, she was the only Republican to hold statewide office in Washington State, and the Democrats desperately wanted to remove her, and so they wanted to file this complaint against her, which they successfully did, and the Attorney General picked it up, and the Attorney General for Washington State is also a Democrat, and they pursued it with great diligence and vigor. And for this great crime of reporting her own finance issues and trying to clean them up herself, she was charged first she was taken to court, made a big fanfare during the election, and she was ultimately charged a little over $10,000.
So $10,000 for missing a deadline, even though she acted as quickly as she could have when she discovered the issue, the error.
After reporting it herself. And in fact, had she not reported it herself and tried to be as transparent as possible, it's very likely nobody would have ever realized there had been a violation in the first place.
Sure.
So, fortunately for Kim, she was reelected anyway, despite this. And this is what these campaign finance complaints are used for: is to basically they throw them at each other, to throw some mud and say, "See, this person is a slime ball. They're trying to be secretive, or they're trying to violate our campaign finance laws, or oh my God, they must be funded by the Koch brothers, George Soros, or somebody." And so that's usually what they do. They throw these things back and forth. And dominantly in Washington State, it's usually the Democrats who are far more skilled and capable at utilizing these laws to throw them at Republicans. Every now and then a Republican gets up enough gumption to throw one back, but mostly that's how it goes. And it's very confusing and chaotic and stuff. Well, I experienced one that was filed against me when I did my little robocall. I really made the Democrat Party very angry at me, and so they filed a complaint and they filed lawsuits, and they were doing everything they can to really get in my face and discourage somebody like me from being involved. And as you know, Robin, I don't usually tend to respond to bullies in that sort of way where I would back off. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try to get to know these laws as well as I possibly can. So I started filing complaints back at them. And these complaints are particularly pernicious because
let's just bridge that there. What you did was you went away and looked at the laws that were used against you when you were doing robocalls, that were used against Kim Wyman for clearly political purposes, even though there was clearly no immorality on her part. And so you were like, okay, I'm gonna learn what this weapon is and how to wield it, right?
Yes, and in fact, the first one that I had filed against a local state senator candidate, a Democrat locally in the Olympia area, he wrote back and he said, no, these complaints have no merit. Glenn Morgan doesn't know anything about campaign finance law.
Hold on a second, we're missing a bit here, Glenn. The point being was you educated yourself, and then you decided that the best form of defense is offense, and you decided that if they can come at you with this stuff, with these essentially frivolous, politically motivated complaints, then two can play at that game, right? And so you turned this into a kind of activism, a means of activism, right, to make a point.
Right. Yes, and the point, to some extent, is to show that, number one, the rules are written in such a way that every single person is actually violating them. All these elected officials, Democrat or Republican, but particularly Democrats, are violating them, and that they're written in a way that it's almost impossible to totally comply with them.
Right.
And so when I had filed, one of my first complaints was against a state senator. It was my earlier complaints before I even got to know the law better, and he said I didn't know what I was talking about. So he didn't say that when I filed the second one a month later, when it was much more comprehensive and thorough, and I really was able to get everything in that one. And so it kind of inspired me, because he was right. I needed to learn and be much more educated about that law. And eventually, the election season's over, and usually these people stop doing this stuff because one side won or the other side won, and the rest of them go home and lick their wounds or celebrate. But I thought, there's no reason to stop if these campaign finance violations are going on, and our Democrat Attorney General said that he wanted to prioritize.
Glenn, stop there. We're going into the break. Hold your thought. We'll be back in a second. In 2011, Robin Koerner wrote the article that launched the biggest coalition for Ron Paul's presidential run, called Blue Republican. Now, Stairway Press is pleased to announce the publication of his first book, If You Can Keep It, Why We Nearly Lost It and How We Get It Back. Jeffrey Tucker, who wrote the foreword, says brilliant ideas come in effervescent packages. This is a good description of Robin Koerner's provocative work. It's a work of stunning erudition and sincerity. I also happen to agree with it. I've been struggling toward a similar thesis for a good part of my writing career, though I'm certain Robin has gone beyond even my most mature thought. His section on liberty as a realization of a civilization of love truly sweeps me away with its insight and depth. I know that time is short and that people don't read as carefully as they should, but this section deserves close study by every advocate of liberty. It will change the way you think and speak about the topic. We need this book now. Pre-order your personally signed copy of If You Can Keep It at ifyoucankeepit.us. Hey there, Glenn. I had to cut you off as we hit the bumper music on that last segment. So just recap the story you were telling.
Well, and so basically, like we were saying before, I had these complaints that were filed against me, campaign finance law, violations, kind of trivial, frivolous complaints. I had watched what happened to the only Republican in Washington State that held a statewide office at the time, at the state level, and the complaints that had been filed against her, and the fact that she was fined $10,100 for being honest and self-reporting, but nevertheless violating the technical part of the statute, of the rules. And so I started filing them against many of these other people who had been critical of my efforts, who tended to be Democrats. And what started happening is I started to realize everybody's in violation of this statute. And so I just started filing more and more of them, and I just started systematically going down and identifying these people who were violating the laws. And an interesting backstory to this was that the Attorney General who enforces these laws and had run on a campaign platform saying that he really wanted, his name's Bob Ferguson, he campaigned that he really wanted to get tough on campaign finance law. In fact, he dedicated several of his attorneys in the Attorney General's office to, by God, they were going to enforce the campaign finance laws. And generally they were going after Republicans, right, or anti-tax activists, or conservative lobbying groups or something. That had been dominantly what
basically these politicians were going against people that wanted to reduce the power of politicians. That would seem to be the thread here, right? The theme.
Yeah. More often than not, that's exactly what they were doing. And so, but the statute isn't written to say you can only file complaints against Republicans. It's just you can use these laws and complaints, and you can file them against Democrats, lo and behold. And so I started to file them, and at this point in time, I have filed, I think I'm close to 40 right now, against different legislators or Democrat Party PACs or different groups like that. And two of them so far have actually, the Attorney General's been forced, because of the way it's written, to go to court on them, and there's going to be several more that probably come up. And I used the Kim Wyman standard. If she could get in trouble for what she did, that was the minimum threshold of what I would report on somebody else. Usually it was a lot more than just that. Yeah. It was a bunch of other things. And, and it was funny because the these bureaucrats, of course, started to get very frustrated because they expected this to be their downtime when they didn't have to work as hard because the campaign season was over.
Yes.
And they had indicated to me that now suddenly they were having to work a whole lot harder. And I think mainly they were they didn't want to have to work to deal with these campaign finance violations that were being committed by Democrats who shared the same party affiliation that they did. They didn't ever complain about it when it was Republicans, but now suddenly they're complaining about it now. But they're in a very big quandary because the way this statute is written, and has been abused, I think, is that if a citizen files this, if you go through the right kind of a process, and it's much more complicated than I'm making it sound, but it is fairly complicated, but if you do it correctly, if the Attorney General decides after 45 days not to take that politician or that candidate to court, where they're doing a formal investigation and they actually litigate against them, I, as a citizen who's filed the complaint, have the legal right to take them to court myself on behalf of the state of Washington. And there's no personal benefit to me in that process, but the attorneys who would represent, in effect, the state of Washington would have their attorney's fees paid for by those politicians who violated those rules, as well as whatever fines that they would be assigned would also have to go then back to the state of Washington. I'd be helping solve some of the budget deficit problems in the state in that kind of a process.
Now, just to be clear, not the politicians that you're targeting here. They having to pay the attorney's fees, the state's attorney's fees. That's only if they're basically found in violation, if they're found guilty. But you're confident, given how these rules are written, these campaign finance rules are written, that they are going to be found guilty on some counts, right?
Correct. Because the way this statute exists, they only have to be found guilty of one minor technical violation to be responsible for all of the legal fees.
Wow.
Even if the fine itself is $50, the legal fees could be $10,000, $12,000, $50,000.
Yeah.
And it's, in a lot of ways, there's some disproportionate elements to this, but I'm doing a very thorough job, and I'm doing a pretty thorough job with these filings. And what makes it particularly unfair, I think, for the people who have received the complaints is they have to respond, and in their response, the majority of the time, they're recognizing that, yes, this violation occurred here, yes, that violation occurred there, which means by the time it actually goes to court, you already know these violations have occurred, and they've largely admitted to them. So really, all you're arguing about is how much should the fine be, and
and the attorney's fees are already in the bag, which is really where the real
which is a classic element of administrative law. Administrative law is by itself designed to really deny you due process, the traditional due process that you would get if you were actually charged in a court, in a real court, if you had a criminal crime and you had the right to confront your accusers and present evidence and all that other kind of stuff. Administrative law oftentimes is written in a way, and the process around it that's created, whether it's the Growth Management Hearings Board, whether it's these other little administrative boards, they're designed, in this case, the Public Disclosure Commission is really designed to create a situation where when you go to try to appeal to the next level, you've already put yourself in a terrible position as a defendant where your ability to get out of the morass or to come out being innocent or to really have your day in court is greatly constrained and restricted because of all of these procedural process rules. And the thing that's particularly interesting about it is that most of the people that I'm filing this on are people who support these laws. They think these laws are great, but they never expected anybody to actually look at them very closely. Or they assumed that because nobody ever filed a complaint on them, that they were as innocent as possible, and it was only those Republicans over there who were always guilty of campaign finance violations. And yet they didn't bother to actually read the law and realize that pretty much everybody's in violation because it's almost impossible to comply.
Do you think that these folks who are now being, who are now the target of your complaints and who supported these laws, do you think most of them never actually understood the laws that they were supporting and just how ridiculous and kind of draconian they so basically it really speaks to incompetence, to not doing their job, because you'd think that politicians would have to read the laws they're supporting. I mean, we know they don't, but that seems to be the standard expectation that they're violating, right?
Yeah, and and a lot of this is they assume that that they know in their hearts. None of them go out there and say, "I want to be really dishonest in my campaign and do everything wrong and violate the law." Nobody thinks that. They'll always think, "Well, I'm complying. My heart's in the right place. My intentions are good. So therefore, how could I possibly be violating the law?" The funny thing is, those are the same people who will turn right around and in a code enforcement situation, or somebody's trying to build a barn without a permit or something like that, they'll want to throw the book at them.
But
and it only doesn't feel good when the book suddenly gets thrown back at you,
Yeah, no, absolutely. But you'd think they would know better. You would think that they would know just what a complex, pervasive beast, is the laws that they vote on. I mean, do you think they're surprised that they get caught up on it in it? I mean, they must have a sense.
I think I'm getting the sense that they're quite surprised. Now, of course, they want to personalize it and say it's just this crazy guy, Glenn Morgan, this property rights activist over here that's he's just trying to hurt us, and it's a big partisan scheme, and the Republicans are behind this, right? But what's quite funny about that is when you think about it, the reason why nobody ever normally does this is that the people who finally get themselves educated enough on these laws are usually affiliated really tightly with one party or another. Mm. And although I've been affiliated with the Republicans in many ways, that they're not behind this at all, because if you think about it, if I was, I mean, they might be enjoying the show, but they're not out there to push this because it can always go both ways, right? So really, they're always fearful. They usually exist in fear of the Democrats a lot of times because the Democrats are better at filing these complaints, and so they wouldn't want to file too many on the Democrats because then the Democrats could file a lot more back on them, and so nobody would ever bother to do what I'm doing right now, which is just going through and filing them on everybody on the entire caucus on that side. I'm not there yet, but it's getting there. And because it's to make a point and prove the assertion that I have that everybody's in violation and that great reform is necessary in order for it to be even possible to comply with the crazy rules they've written.
Do you think that will be the ultimate outcome, Glenn, that you will have success in the form of everybody going, this is ridiculous, nobody should be caught up in this net, we're going to change this?
I think that if I can file enough complaints and cover a wide enough swath of people in this, that next session, I don't think this year, but I think next year there's going to be some motivation to make that actually happen. And it's helpful if you have a large enough group of people. And so I'm going after the people first that are least likely to support that, and so that as they're found to be guilty and they're found to be in violation, that it's going to be very difficult for them to deny that there's a problem with this law and with these laws. And so we'll see. I mean, it's my eternal optimism that if you put people through something like this, that usually that encourages some sort of behavioral change. And but it's great. It's great to highlight it. I'm sure that the Attorney General, I was told that I was completely overwhelming the resources of the Attorney General's office and the Public Disclosure Commission. But as I told them, I took the Attorney General at his word. He said he wanted to enforce this law aggressively, and I'm doing my good citizen best to help them do so.
And I'm sure they're most grateful.
What's that?
And I'm sure they're most grateful.
Yeah. I don't get too many people telling me that yet, but I will say, because I have met with some of these bureaucrats, and this is something that our side, I think, needs to remember. Whether anybody who cares about freedom, oftentimes we view the bureaucracy as this monolithic entity out there that's basically absorbing. It's like a black hole, just sucking everything around it in as it gets bigger, and that's true. That's how it behaves. However, it's made up of real people just like you and I. They may see the world very differently, but they're good and bad people that are in there. And it's important to reach out to them and talk to them as you're doing this. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to tell them everything, but I've had meetings with the head of the director. I've gone to their meetings and argued different issues in front of them. And, you have to have a friendly demeanor and happy warrior spirit, I think, when you're doing this, because it makes it a lot easier for them to dismiss you if they see you're in there and you're angry and you're bitter and you don't talk to them, or you you think that talking to them is somehow going to compromise you. You have to reach out to them now. Don't compromise. Don't let yourself be compromised. But I think that it makes it easier to actually get this whole process going.
What would you say?
And
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, what would you say your motivation was for putting so much time into this particular issue? I mean, did you just see what happened to Kim Wyman and go, that's just screwed up, and have that sense of kind of moral outrage, and that was enough to just go for it? Is that what it was?
I would say that was about half of it. And I really thought it was ridiculous at the time. And that was half. And the other half was when they filed one on me. And so that was probably what put it over the edge as far as determining that it was worthwhile. And I'll tell you why, Robin, because I have no intention and never will back down from being involved in the political process. And I spend a lot of my time trying to train and encourage other people to get involved in the political process. And what these types of things do is they discourage people who have good intentions, who want to get involved in the political process. They make it seem like the game is rigged, and that if you dare question them, they're going to come back and beat you up, which is what they're trying to do to me and what they did to Kim Wyman. And so I have to push back on it, because the fundamental element of, I think, of being a good and effective activist is to get involved. And I don't want them to be able to demonstrate that they can succeed. And so it really motivated me, those two events, them coming after me and also them what I watched them do to Kim Wyman. And so here we are, it's 3 months later and 40 complaints down, and I've got a lot more to go. And it's gonna be an interesting year. And like I said, 2 of these cases, the Attorney General's already picked up and is going after them. And the reactions that these, in this case, the 2 different Democrats that have already had the cases filed against them, they're incredibly indignant and they're angry, and they can't believe that anybody could have dared question their motivations. And of course it isn't about motivations, it's about what they actually did. Complying with these laws is close to impossible. And their sloppiness and how they did the forms and the reporting and all that is just another indication, illustration that that's absolutely true.
In the last minute or so of this segment, Glenn, these bureaucrats that you have spoken to in your friendly manner, and you're a very friendly, affable guy, do you think many of them understand this motivation? Like, those who have spoken to you and seen your demeanor, do they realize that you're not just some kind of tit-for-tat, zero-sum game party hack, that you're motivated by the couple of things that you've just indicated have motivated you?
I believe that they probably just think I'm crazy. And that's because everybody tends to project your own view of life onto somebody else and their actions. And I think they look at me and they think, well, I would never want to spend my time doing that. And they know there's no personal gain for me in this. So they're looking at me thinking, what a crazy guy. He's just another activist. They probably also think that I'll go away pretty soon, which is probably going to be very disappointing to them when that doesn't happen. But I imagine that they're probably wondering about that. They may be starting to not think that way so much now as the volume increases, but they have been sympathetic when I've talked about reform. I don't think that they're going to be necessarily sympathetic with the types of reforms that I would like to do.
That was well-timed, Glenn, because we're coming to the end of the third and longest segment. This has been fascinating. I always love talking to you. You always give me such optimism because of what you achieve. This is Liberty with Love. We are going into the final break. We'll be back in a few minutes. So just as we close out the show, Glenn, just for, as they say, shits and giggles, give us an example or two of the kind of violations that you are pointing out in these complaints.
But sure, I'll give you an example. Kashama Sawant, who ran for the Seattle City Council as a socialist, as an outspoken socialist, I had filed a complaint on her, and the $500,000 that she spent in her campaign, her filing documents were riddled with violations. In fact, an egregious volume of violations, one of the larger volumes that I had filed, and that included things like hiring her significant other, or husband, I think, or partner, I think is what she calls him. He was the second largest paid person in her campaign behind the mail house, but also artificially inflating her overall amount of money by taking larger than illegal donation sizes, and then being very slow to kick that money back. And I always think that even a socialist needs to learn that the rules apply to them and not just the little people. Another example would be the Speaker of the House, Frank Chopp, out of Seattle. He had a misuse of personal use of funds illegally under the campaign rules. And Representative Joe Fitzgibbons, also from the Seattle area, who took, in addition to all the violations of his campaign, I was able to find 3 different significant violations that I filed with the Board of Ethics, which is a whole other bureaucratic nightmare, for taking $10,000 illegally as compensation for some junket trips that he took to global warming summits and socialist empowerment meetings of some kind. So those are just classic little examples, and anybody that wants to see what I've done, you can see them online at the website, the Public Disclosure Commission Enforcement Cases.
And what is the website?
If you look up Public Disclosure Commission, Washington State, you can look at the enforcement lists, and you will see these complaints that I filed with them. They become a public record usually within about a day or so, and they're listed on their website.
Thanks for everything you do, Glenn. I've enjoyed speaking with you this last hour. This is Liberty with Love. If you want to check out some of the recent shows, or even some of the very old shows, go to the archives at libertytalk.fm. And also you can catch these shows on my YouTube channel, Robin Koerner, Art of Political Persuasion. This show is nothing without you, my listeners, so thanks for being with me. We do live in interesting times, and I guess it's my job to reflect them back and maybe to add a little bit of understanding. Thanks for being with me. Have another great week. I will be with you all next weekend.
Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.